Now, the mpox virus is spreading through Africa like wildfire. In the meantime, the slow acquisition of vaccines is reminiscent of the COVID-19 pandemic, which claimed scores of lives. The US is donating 10,000 vaccine shots to Africa. This will be the continent's first batch of vaccines against the deadly virus, which is due to arrive this week, when an alarm around the outbreak was raised in 2022. Alex van den Heever, who's a healthcare governance expert from Wits University, joins us now with more on this. Prof, thank you for your time and a good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
All right, Prof, maybe we can start off by just trying to understand, when we speak of mpox, just how prevalent is this virus at this time? How much has it spread? Are we at crisis level? Are we heading towards crisis level?
So first thing to note is that it's quite different from COVID. So COVID's method of transmission it's an airborne transmitted virus and transmitted extremely rapidly. And, you could be across the room and get infected. Mpox is quite different in that it really requires very close proximity, essentially an exchange of body fluids, which is why the transmission is almost equivalent to that of HIV and a sexually transmitted disease. So the number of cases is relatively small, although in South Africa it's quite clear now that there is community-based transmission. It's much easier to manage contact tracing with this, but unlike COVID, which was so rapid that the number of contacts just exponentially increases very quickly, and you can't reach all the people who could potentially in contact. So the number of cases is relatively small of those that were symptomatic, and the number of deaths is also relatively small. But because we don't know the people who are asymptomatic and many people with mild cases, we can't be sure, because a lot of the severe cases are those who are people who had untreated, unmanaged HIV, which is a particular group which already has their immunity compromised. And that might be the reason why we're seeing more severe cases of those patients, but not the general population.
Thank you for that context, Prof. I think very important to understand that one. Then I want to speak about the issue of, responding as a continent, as South Africa here. Where are we in terms of response, and what the appropriate method of response is here? When we speak of vaccines, is that a vaccine for everybody? Is it those who are just infected? What are we trying? How are we trying to manage it?
Well, the first thing to note is that there is treatment. And so the treatments are now available in South Africa. So the treatments are being administered. So again, in comparison to COVID, there were no treatments up front. And so that made it difficult. And we actually were in such a position that we wouldn't really have treatments available until, and it would be better to try and prevent with the vaccine. And then there's a long development time for the vaccine. We do have the vaccines as well, but they are only just becoming available now. And the idea would really be only to give these to the high risk groups. So you'd give them sort of prophylactically, you'd give them up front to people who are at high risk of infection, and some of those have just recently been infected. So the population that would need the vaccine is going to be relatively small and targeted at the higher risk groups, because we're not going to have the number of vaccines that we had for COVID, and to kind of attempt to kind of do population-wide vaccinations. These are going to be really for high-risk people in HIV groups, and also those who are sexually active, where there's a high probability of an exchange of bodily fluids within a high-risk community.
With that said, Prof, another one that's interesting here, I guess, is the fact that the vaccines are going to come out of South Africa. And I want to speak then about the African continent, I guess, is large, and vaccine preparedness based on COVID-19. Very tough lessons learned. We've seen some of the private sector, commit to building vaccine capacity. But, I'm wondering if we have built capacity, maybe mpox is not the time when we have to respond, urgently. But based on the lessons learned then, the lessons we're learning now, are we moving in this regard?
So I don't think that our capabilities have necessarily improved from COVID, although there have been lessons learned, and they're at a number of levels. The one is the test and trace level. In other words, the pathology testing. And in the the public-private response and then coordinating it through the NICD, the National Institute for Communicable Diseases, is an important strategy which is being followed now. So this is now a notifiable condition, which means if it's picked up at the private sector as well as the public, the NICD must be notified. And that allows for a response to be targeted at, and for people, a team to go in and do some contact tracing and try and find who they were in contact with. So that test and trace is one feature of it. The second feature is treatment. There is treatment available, wasn't available under COVID. So you want to get treatment to the high-risk individuals as quickly as possible. So there were a few deaths, but in comparison to the number of cases, the mortality rate would be relatively high, but not everybody died. And there's quite the possibility of quite a lot of people who have relatively mild infections that we don't know about. So that really comes through surveillance. So surveillance is important. And then the vaccines. Vaccine development is slow. And potentially when you've got an urgent situation like this, you want to have, you're often going to be testing the vaccines or testing the treatment before you've gone through the full normal process for clinical trials, etc. You've got to kind of act more expeditiously, and you can't wait for finality. So I think that in this case, we will probably be monitoring people very closely who receive the vaccine to see whether they're efficacious, and also whether or not there are any side effects that are problematic. So I think that the populations that would have to access them are relatively small at this stage, which means that they're within the capability of government at this point, whereas they exceeded the capability of government during COVID.
And I'm also keen, Prof, before I let you go here, just as a parting shot, you've mentioned that we haven't really built the capacity, we haven't improved in that regard. That is a matter of concern to me. Just from your perspective here, how do we, why? Maybe the question is just why? Why are we not improving in the vaccine development part as a continent, as a country?
So vaccine development, so there's one thing which is vaccine development. The other is actually producing it for general use. And the problem there is that the platforms that for the actual development of the vaccine, basically the production of the vaccine in South Africa, because the very relatively low demand means that the cost per vaccine that is produced is relatively high. Now, in the case of COVID, that could be prohibitive because the quantities that they were required at, which means that if the unit was expensive, then the overall expenditure would be very, very high. So South Africa would have to have very high volumes. And the problem is South Africa's own demand is too low to generate low average costs of production. So you'd have to have a global markets in order to bring down the average cost of production. And South Africa doesn't really have that. So it would only be producing for domestic consumption. So the vaccine production can be constrained by the volumes. And in the cases such as this of a sort of a relatively small outbreak, means that you might have a little bit of a raised demand for a while and then it drops off. Now, you can't invest in a whole production facility and then the demand just trails off. So these are the problems. So very often the large global actors with the large production facilities that are producing globally tend to be where the vaccines are created. And that is a problem for resilience, vaccine resilience in countries like South Africa, because you do want to not be caught up in the situation where all of the vaccines that are developed are hoarded by the countries in which the production facilities lie. So I think this is still a problem that South Africa has to solve. That part is a difficult one. It's not easy to solve. It's not something that it's about government competence alone. It's about having an industrial strategy that overlays a health resilience strategy, basically a public health strategy. And it's kind of difficult to bring these two together in South Africa. They're quite siloed in the relevant departments, and it's quite a complex problem to solve. Plus, you're dealing with an industry that is impacted by global commercial imperatives. So they don't easily give up their IP. They don't easily give up markets just to help a country get resilience. So you have to overcome that as part of a strategy. I don't think South Africa is really in that position, but I don't think that we will have a problem accessing this particular vaccine over time. I think it will be fine. I think it's when we're dealing with the next airborne virus, that we're going to have something in place, and we don't. And it's also about testing, because then you have to do high volumes of testing, and you have to have enough test kits for millions of people.
Well, Prof, thank you for putting that into perspective for us. I think this is a conversation we'll keep having for very obvious reasons. Thank you for your time. That was Alex van der Neeven. He is a healthcare governance expert at Wits University.